Thank you so much for that, Aditi. Thank you for showing up on a Friday evening, everybody. Thank you to Giles Tillotson, the curator of DAG, for organizing this, and thank you to Rana Savvi, the curator of this exhibition, for inviting us to contribute to the wonderful catalog and to this exhibition. For those of you who have been following the wonderful talks that have been taking place around this exhibition, you will have heard a lot of really, really interesting, insightful things about the Taj Mahal, about its amazing beauty, about the iconography around it, about the calligraphy, about the beautiful charbagh structure of the Taj, and all the symbology around all these different things. Today, we are here to talk about something quite different. Emily will be talking to us a little bit later about the way in which the Taj was first described. And you know, it is the Europeans who first actually described and painted the Taj Mahal for us as a separate structure. We tended in India not to do that. So we'll be hearing about these European travelers and then women travelers in the 19th century. But I will be focusing on the women around the legend of the Taj apart from Mumtaz Mahal. Because this story of Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal and their love, their incandescent love, has taken over narratives to such an extent that all the other women have been pushed into the shadows, and we tend to forget the many, many women who walked alongside Shah Jahan. There were women right from the beginning who shaped his aesthetics, women like Noor Jahan. There were women other than Mumtaz Mahal that he married, who stayed with him. The women he married later, who were his companions in the later part of his life, those who accompanied him in the 7 dreadful years of his incarceration, who offered consolation and support at such a terrible time, and there were his daughters, especially Jahanara Begum, who aligned her own ambitions exactly alongside Shah Jahan's, no less than the emperor's ambition, which we will be discussing, if we get time, a little later. But what I wanted to start with and give you a little bit of an overview with, I think you will appreciate, as we go through this presentation, that it is extremely hard to recover the voices of Mughal women when the biographers are set on keeping them invisible. We know that from the time of Akbar, an order was given that Mughal women were too exalted. Their status was now beyond the purview of regular mortals, people like you and I. So we should never know not only what they looked like naturally, but even their names were to be hidden from us. So their names were never spoken in a public space where non-elite family members might hear it. They were given instead titles. Even Mumtaz Mahal is a title. Her name was Arjuman Bano. But for the other women, it becomes extremely difficult to sort of get a comprehensive idea of what these women were like, what their ambitions were like, what they were able to achieve. So sometimes it is not as straightforward looking at these beautiful images because there were very few that I could access. Instead, I have to look at a whole variety of different sources. Did they write anything, for example? Did they build anything themselves? Did they sponsor anything? Did they go on any trips? Did they write biographies? And we will find that all these things did happen, but it takes a real act of will to gather all of that together to get a sense of who and what these women were all about. So I'll just start with this first very evocative image, which is here right next to Emily, in fact, which describes the last years of Shah Jahan. You will all know that he was incarcerated by his son Aurangzeb. He spent more than 7 years in Agra, in the fort, in the Zanana Mahal mostly, but he was not alone. What we know from a traveler, a French traveler at that time, François Bernier, he wrote and said, "I am shocked that all the great Mughal noblemen have abandoned Shah Jahan's cause the minute Aurangzeb rose against him." So all the great noblemen immediately went over to the person whose star was rising, i.e. Aurangzeb, and pretty much abandoned Shah Jahan at this time. But he was not abandoned by his women. A whole zenana of women chose to accompany him. His eldest daughter by Mumtaz Mahal, Jahanara Begum, chose to accompany him. She was offered by Aurangzeb the chance to come with him to Delhi and become Padshah Begum of Aurangzeb's harem, but she preferred to stay loyal to her father who had given her so much. She stayed with him right till the end. And in fact, the biographers have it that she watched over his dying hours. She recited the Quranic verses to him that were necessary at this time, and she is the one who heard his last wishes, his dying wishes, which were that she look after his consort, his wife, Akbaribadi Begum, and the other women in his harem, and also his eldest daughter, who was not Jahanara Begum, but was the daughter of a previous marriage, his first marriage. A girl, she was much older by this time, but she was unmarried. A woman, again, whose name we are not certain of, maybe Punhur Begum, but we are not exactly sure of what her name was. But he particularly recommended to Jahanara that she look out for these specific women. So we know that these women were around him and with him in his time of greatest need. Now, who were these women? Who were these marriages? We hear only of Mumtaz Mahal and how very much in love they were and how no other woman was possibly necessary for a man like Shah Jahan. Now, as you may not guess from the magnificence of this image, but I actually created this. And in fact, when Shivani from DAG saw my PPT, she sent me a worried SMS saying, Ira, are you sure you meant for this image? Is it, a glitch on your computer? And I was like, no. It may come as no surprise to all of you that when all us scholars, 7 of us, were looking through the DAG archives for images that were relevant for our essays, I was very envious of the other scholars because they all had a wealth of images to choose from. They were fighting to be allocated more images. Somebody was asking for 12, somebody 15, somebody said, no, I cannot possibly write my essay without 20 images. And I, in my corner, was saying, what in God's name am I going to include in my essay? There is nothing, okay? So a lot of the images that I am going to show are created by myself. So this image I made to kind of show you how difficult it is to talk about these women. So this, of course, is a later 19th century imaginary image of Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal. But I have used various iterations to tell you, to begin with, that Mumtaz Mahal was not even the first woman he married. So they were affianced, they were engaged when they were very young, 14, 15, but Mumtaz Mahal's father fell into slight disrepute at this time, and so they decided to put the engagement on a back burner, and instead Shah Jahan got married at the age of 19 to a very prestigious woman, a woman from the daughter of Sultan Hussain Mirza Safavi, the ruler of Kandahar himself. So we know that this wedding was extremely important to the Mughal house. She was a woman with a great lineage, a lot of prestige around her name, and there are descriptions of the wedding. So this was no shoddy, shabby affair at all. It was held in the palace of Maryam-uz-Zamani herself, Jahangir's mother, Akbar's wife, and it was held in the palace which had belonged to Maryam Makani before, Hamida Banu Begum. So clearly a place that was loaded with symbology, which had the backing of these great Mughal matriarchs. And so this was a great celebration, a great wedding. Shah Jahan, he was not Shah Jahan, he was Mirza Khurram at this stage, and he invited his father to attend a celebration in his own palace grounds, and for that he laid carpets right from the Agra Diwan-e-Aam all the way to his own palace, the special chair which had been assigned for his father Jahangir. So all the way Jahangir walked on carpets and was entertained in a lavish manner at Mirza Khurram's residence. And so we know that this wedding was celebrated in great style. They had a child, a daughter, Purhun Begum, whom we will find at the very end of Shah Jahan's life. So she was there, this young woman who grew up alongside all the other siblings, all the children that Mumtaz Mahal would have. Then we have, of course, the marriage of Mumtaz Mahal and Shah Jahan happens, and 2 years after that, there would be a third marriage to the daughter of Shah Nawaz Khan, who himself was the son of Abdur Rahim. So you all are familiar with the name name of Abdul Rahim Khan Khanum, the writer of Doha, the writer of poetry, the one who built Abdul Rahim's tomb here in Delhi. So again, a very prestigious affair, a very important wedding. But when the biographers write about it, because already now Mumtaz Mahal has started taking over the imagination, she is already the favorite wife. So they write about this wedding in pretty critical terms, and I have to say, if you will pardon my language, fairly bitchy terms, in saying, well, we just did this to assuage the hurt feelings of Shah Nawaz Khan because he had fallen a little bit from favor. So just to make up for that, he had to marry his daughter. But this was nothing great. There was no intimacy. There was no love. The love was all for Mumtaz Mahal. So you see, you have to really fight against those kind of biographers who have already clearly decided that Mumtaz Mahal and Shah Jahan are the ones who are really going to be written about, and this biography is very tightly curated. Then we have the women who come into his life later. Now, let's be very real here. Shah Jahan was 39 years old when he lost Mumtaz Mahal. He was a man in the prime of his life, a passionate man, a man who had only 3 years been emperor. He had decades ahead of him. He would live for 35 more years. He would be emperor, Shah Jahan, shadow of God on earth, all these great things for most of his life without Mumtaz Mahal. So, of course, he married women. Of course, there were other women in his life. There are three whose names, well, not their names, but their titles. So we have Akbarabadi Begum, Fatehpuri Begum, and Sirindi Begum that we at least have some information about. So these names were given to them either from their place of birth. So if Akbarabadi would be Agra, so either she came from Agra, or it would be the place where the emperor first saw this lady and first decided to marry her. So maybe this was where he met her. So this is all we know from their names. Their names tell us almost nothing. So we need to look elsewhere to get an idea of who these women were. Again, a fantastic image created by me, which is... You will agree that the neon green is particularly effective here. And what I wanted to show you was that after the Taj Mahal was built, you would think that Shah Jahan would live in the shadow of this great remnant of his love for the rest of his life, but he didn't. As we know, he packed his bags and baggage, his entourage, his entire court, and decided to build Shah Jahanabad, a city from scratch here in Delhi, what we call Old Delhi today. And what is extraordinary is that while Shah Jahan commissioned what we call the Red Fort and the great walls all around this city, the rest of his buildings he handed over to his great noblemen and extraordinarily to his wives and his unmarried daughters to build as they chose. Now remember that these are extremely independently wealthy women. They are not women who have to come to Shah Jahan to get money assigned to them. They inherit money and they maintain that money by sometimes investing in trade. We know that some of these women owned trade ships on which they made huge fortunes. So we are talking about some of the wealthiest women in the world. Because at this time, under Shah Jahan, we are talking about the wealthiest empire in the world. So we see all these buildings that these women commission. Everything in green is built by Jahan Ara Begum. So we have the Chandni Chowk, the bazaar, the main bazaar of Old Delhi. We have behind it the huge Begum Ka Bagh, which was an enormous area, which she then developed with pavilions, baradris, fountains to make into a pleasure garden. She built hammams opposite from it, public baths. She built an enormous caravanserai. For those of you who are not familiar, it's like a hotel, but it's not like Oyo rooms. It's like a 7-star resort. It's like a really fancy, beautifully appointed place for the elite from all over the world to come. And she had her name written, engraved in calligraphy on it, saying this belongs to Begum Sahiba, so that people who enter it will know her name. So these are the ways in which you could work against the veiling, against the parda. You could get your name said, pronounced, and known, even though you are meant to be in the absolute strictest parda. That Jahan Ara Begum, then Akbarabadi Begum, whom we have spoken about as being the very first, not the very first, but the woman who was there at his very at his bedside when Shah Jahan was dying, she built everything here, the orange Fairs Bazaar, which was her bazaar. She built a caravansarai, she built a mosque, and she built hammams. The blue is Fatehpuri Begum, and the colors have sort of not held. The ones on the left, the dark green is supposed to be pink, that's Sirindi Begum. So we know that these wives and the daughter of Shah Jahan were building these incredible structures. And scholar Stephen Blake has talked about these structures built by Mughal women at this time. He compares them to what was being done in the Ottoman Empire at the exact same time in Isfahan. So there too, royal women were building. But there are three big differences. The scale of the building, the scale of the monuments is far greater here in Mughal India because the women are that much more wealthy. So they have all these resources to build. Secondly, while the women in Isfahan built religious structures, by far, so mosques and madrasas, here the women are also building secular structures like caravansarais, gardens, hammams, bazaars, which are very much in the everyday life or the bustling life of the regular people, not just religious structures. And thirdly, whereas in Isfahan it is mostly married women, his wives, here there are also unmarried daughters who are patronizing so openly these incredible structures which bear their names. So once we get a sense of what these women have done, women like Akbarabadi Begum, Fatehpuri and Sirhindi Begum, then we can understand their importance and what we can infer perhaps from the structures we now see today around the Taj Mahal. So we have in this sketch plan of the Taj Mahal, you will see at the bottom below here, there are two tombs and there are two further structures on either side, on the eastern side and on the western side. And these are all called in the sort of companionable platonic name of Saheli Burj. Like a sisterhood here with no identity, no idea really of who these women are. But it is believed that the two tombs here at the bottom on the right and then the left, just adjoining the Jalal Khana, are possibly the tombs of Akbarabadi Begum and Fatehpuri Begum. My friend Sarthak in the audience here may have reservations about that. And the problem is that there are no inscriptions, nothing that tells us who these women were. In the biographies, it's not really written down that we decided to build these tombs for these women. So a lot of it is just putting information together, trying to understand what was happening and what then later travelers, which Emily will tell us about, what they were saying about these structures. But if you look at these two tomb structures, you will agree that there's a great similarity in them. And the historian Ebba Koch has said that they are like mirror images of each other. They are both these sort of mausoleum complexes on a platform with a charbagh in front of it. So like echoing the riverside building of the Taj Mahal itself. And she proposes that this white marble on the dome itself is an imperial prerogative. So it would be imperial women who are buried here. And therefore, we come to the conclusion that this may be these two women. This tomb, which is on the right-hand side of the complex, is today called Sirhindi Begum, but this name has changed in the past. The one on the left continues to be called Fatehpuri Begum. And then we have a very interesting and sort of unusual structure which nobody seems to know very much about, which is on the outer, slightly on the outer side to the east of the complex. Today it is called either Sandhali, which is sandalwood mosque complex, or the Kali Masjid or the Kandahari Masjid. So very confusing nomenclatures, but once again, if you look at the tomb itself, you will see a lot of similarities with what we have just seen. The same marble-clad dome, the same guldasta type pattern on those little structures around, the same covered veranda type all around, which seems to echo what we have seen. This, finally, we have one image which is from the DAG collection on the top left. So this, yes, exists. It's a photograph of what was then known as the Kali Masjid and the Kandahari Begum's tomb from 1850. And finally, we have a tomb to the west of the Taj complex, and that is commonly held to be the tomb of a woman called Sati-un-Nisa Begum, another very important lady who was superintendent of the harem. She came in from Persia accompanying her very talented poet brother, and she was taken into the harem where she was a close confidant of Mumtaz Mahal and also helped her supervise the harem. She was a physician, a very learned woman, a woman who spoke many languages, so she helped in the education of the children and generally in the running of the imperial harem. And it is believed that this might be her tomb complex. It is what it is generally held to be. So I think I will leave it at this point, and we can come to that later. But I think at this point I would like to ask Emily, because the Europeans are really the first to write about some of these structures and give a name to them and tell us something about them. I would like to call her in to tell us what her insights are about these paintings.
Thank you very much, Ira. Can you hear me? Sounds booming to me, but thank you, Ira. So I am, as she said, going to tell you about the paintings that illustrate the catalogue that's so beautifully edited by Rana sitting here in the front. In fact, all the chapters that you'll read about when you all buy the books, I'm sure you're going to, give us the context, the contemporary context to the Taj, from the calligraphy to the women that Ira's talking about, etc. My chapter is a bit different. It is a purely art historical paper that tells you why we've got all these paintings here around us. In fact, why we can have this exhibition at all. So let me begin. So the Taj Mahal in Agra has inspired awe from its very earliest visitors to those flocking to see it to this day. It's admired, as you're all very aware, for its arresting proportions, the white marble that changes hue according to what time of day, and above all for its romantic symbolism, being the tomb for Mumtaz Mahal, as Ira has explained. So the appeal for artists and photographers, tourists, worshippers alike, lies in this unique combination of the aesthetics and the romantic and also the sacred. And the earliest European visitors to Agra, not long after it was built, in fact, the earliest person to write about it was a Frenchman, just already mentioned by Ira, François Bernier, and he was there in 1659. And he writes quite a lot about the Taj. He was very impressed. And among this few paragraphs that he wrote about it, he says it should be numbered among the wonders of the world. So already very early on, a European visitor recognized this as an exceptional building, unlike something he'd ever seen before. But it took about 100 years later for Europeans to really start visiting in considerable numbers. So, to just repeat, he was visiting in 1659, but it wasn't until the last few decades of the 18th century that it really begins to pick up the visitors and the artists, which is what we're most interested in. And that's really when, certainly from a European and worldwide perspective, it became seen as this icon of the romantic ideal. So the early travelers, they came from all over Europe, a little bit later America, and a little bit later also Japan and Russia. But it really was the British, as I'm sure you can imagine why, who ensured that the Taj was known worldwide due to the vast number of paintings and prints that were produced. I don't need to really remind this audience, but reminders are always good, I think. The Europeans were drawn primarily to India for trade. First of all, the Portuguese, later the Dutch, French, and then, of course, the British East India Company, established in 1600. But it wasn't until after the famous Battle of Plassey in 1757 that we really that is one of the reasons why we start getting more visitors. They start to hear more about it. And Although trade continued to remain the strongest lure for Europeans, other visitors beside the merchants and army officers began to arrive, including scholars and artists. It became a time of intense intellectual exploration in Indian culture, from religion, literature to architecture. And obviously, we're all aware of the colonial ambitions for the majority of the East India Company. And they carried out these incredibly extensive surveys, above all to monitor what could be profitable. So looking at crops and minerals and all these sorts of things. But there was another strain of intellectuals who were looking at the art and architecture. And arguably, you could say they were primarily driven by intellectual and artistic interests. So turning to the image on our screen here, the first artist, British artist, to visit the Taj was someone called William Hodges. And he arrived in Agra in 1783, towards the end of quite an extensive tour. He went all around with his tent and his easels, painting everything he saw. And he was awestruck, like everybody else, when he first arrived at the Taj. And I'm just going to quote his words. He writes, "From the view across the Yamuna River," I quote, "the most perfect pearl on an azure ground. The effect is such that I confess I've never experienced from any work of art. The fine materials, the beautiful forms, and the symmetry of the whole, and the judicious choice of situations far surpasses anything I ever beheld." I'm going to repeat myself quite a lot because this is pretty much verbatim what all the Europeans are going to say. But it's quite important to have a sense of how speechless and awestruck they were, one after another. And Hodges, he very much saw himself not only as a wandering artist needing to make money by ultimately selling his prints when he got home, but he definitely saw himself as part of this journey of discovery amongst naturalists, philosophers, linguists, historians, the sorts of people that I like to focus on and emphasize. So he came to Varanasi in 1784 with Warren Hastings, I'm sure you've all heard of, patron of the Royal Asiatic Society in Bengal, and then later also in London. And Hodges' paintings were, he was a trained artist, so his paintings are very sensitively realized images from acute observation that he then translated to aquatints, which were quite expensive prints that were sold in great numbers when he got back, well, to those who could afford it anyway. The next artist to arrive very soon after, in fact, overlapping with William Hodges, which one do I press? Were the Daniels. Some of you may have already heard of the Daniels. There was Thomas Daniel, who lived from 1749 to 1840, and his nephew William. And they arrived sort of pretty much just as William Hodges was leaving. And they sort of copied him. They saw his itinerary, like lots of us travellers do, and go, "Oh, good idea. I'll go to the same places." But in our title, we use the word picturesque. And it was this picturesque, very overused expression now, but back then it was a relatively fresh, new aesthetic that Hodges and the Daniels brought with them to India. This was their mindset when they came. So the same building can have a different, an artist can produce a different image of it according to what they're looking for. And they were very much looking for this picturesque viewpoint. The picturesque, just to briefly summarize, was concerned with representing awe-inspiring scenes that were also serenely beautiful and sublime, often seen obliquely. They loved ruins. They liked it being slightly obscured by foliage. I mean, it's an aesthetic we probably all find appealing even to this day. But anyway, it was new then. So it was above all architecture shown in combination with a landscape setting. That was key. Shown in this irregular and asymmetric way, even though the Taj is so symmetrical, so challenging for them to, always see the Taj from one side or the other. So before the 1780s, so before these individual artists I've just mentioned arrived in India, the British public had seen very few images of India. They really were quite ignorant. They just heard these stories, but they hadn't seen images of the art or people. But after this, it changed dramatically. So we have these professional artists who were then producing these fairly expensive aquatints, and they were followed quite soon after by also more professional artists, but also amateur artists, who then produced slightly cheaper lithograph prints, which circulated then even more widely. And it kind of, these newly arrived images in India gripped the British. And I'm sure you all know about the Brighton Pavilion. I thought I'd just flash up a bit of the Brighton Pavilion in front of you now. So this was exactly the moment when the British were seeing these images and, in awe of them and thinking, right, I want something a bit like that. Build me some hodgepodge building with domes and turrets that, doesn't relate to anything you see in India, but to a largely ignorant British audience, this felt like a sense of what was back in India. So in reality, we had this sort of romantic, picturesque viewpoint that the Europeans were presenting to the UK and European audience back at home. But in reality, Agra was not in a great state at that time, as Sarthak illustrates beautifully in his chapter. A lot of the buildings were in quite a ruinous state. The garden was beautiful and productive, lots of fruit trees, but it was quite overgrown. And lots of the houses were in ruin, and the Pietra Dura was being picked out. So it was not in a great state. In 1803, someone called Lord Lake took the cities of Delhi and Agra. Not going to put a value judgment on that, just fact. This is what happened. And they didn't manage to stop the Pietra Dura being picked out, but they became, it became increasingly interested in Agra and analysing and trying to look after it and restore aspects of the Taj. Next image I think I want now. So my segue to connect with Ira's talk is women. Although I've just talked about male artists, the majority of the artists, certainly the professional ones, were male, we start getting in the early 19th century European women arriving. So before that, I'm sure you've all read William Dalrymple's book, The White Moguls. On the whole, British women weren't arriving. It was men from the East India Company who often married local women. In the early 19th century, women started to arrive, and one of the well-known women is someone called Emily Eden, who's on your screen here, and she came out to accompany her brother, who was the Governor General at the time. And she did many sketches and watercolours and wrote her diary, and then later published it. She published several books. The most well-known is something called Upcountry. And it became very well-known back in the UK. Many editions were made. She herself, it has to be said, she's not a totally appealing character for me. She's quite acerbic. She's witty. She's funny. She's aristocratic, very well-educated woman. She's interested in India, and she travels quite widely, but she's also quite condescending to this other lady who I prefer, called Fanny Parks. Have you heard of Fanny Parks? Yes. So she's much more appealing, I think, but interestingly, her diary was largely overlooked. She didn't have the social status that Emily Eden had and other women who were associated with the aristocracy who had arrived in India. Instead, she was a wife of an ordinary chap, an ordinary colonial administrator who clearly was a little mentally unstable at times, which meant she often left him behind and jumped on her horse and went off with her tent around India for 24 years.
I always had my doubt that he ever existed, her husband, because we have no record of the husband. He's like a disappeared Mughal woman.
Well, that's good, the other way around. So yes, that's interesting if anyone wants to research and get back to us on who he was and what happened to him. But yeah, she traveled for 24 years, and I guess why she's appealing is that she is sort of naturally exuberant and enthusiastic about India in quite an open-minded way, but she was also quite serious about it on another level. She learned Urdu. She really wanted to go and meet women and find out from the inside what was going on and what it was like to live in a zenana, something that the British men would not have known, unless, of course, they were married to one. So, and she overlaps with Emily Eden. And there's this quite amusing passage in Emily Eden's diary. Actually, I think it's her sister, Fanny Eden, who writes a diary. And they talk about this really annoying, overweight woman who keeps hanging on to their camp. And generally, they try to shed her. But I think probably they're kind of irritated because she is far more naturally interested and knowledgeable. She's much more traveled than them quite quickly. She's learnt the languages. So maybe they need to sort of put her down a bit. So something, if you haven't read, for you to read. There's a new edition came out not that long ago, so easy to get hold of. And in this recent edition that came out, she's described as one of the greatest travel writers of all time. But that's quite a recent opinion, I'd say. There are all sorts of stories about her, but don't want to go on too long. But one is she met a princess, a Maratha princess, I think it was in Gwalior, who really wanted her to try to demonstrate horse riding and side saddle. Do you know this story? And so she does this, and then the Maratha lady asks her to try in the Indian style, which she then does. And she then goes into diatribe about how bad it was that Queen Victoria forced the women to ride in this way. So she's very adventurous and endlessly criticising the British, which is probably one of the reasons why she has been overlooked and was marginalised a bit, because she became more and more critical. Even though it was, it was a diary, it was overlooked. So there are two strains of paintings that you can see around you here. There are those that were produced by largely British, but also other Europeans. Later we get American, Japanese, but there are also the paintings by Indian artists. Sadly, a lot of them don't have the names, so you'll see in the captions, Agra artist, often, as you're going to see in mine. Oh, sorry, I forgot to say, this is an original edition of Fanny Park's memoir, and notice that the title is Wanderings of a Pilgrim in Search of the Picturesque. So that picturesque word again. This is how she saw herself, as part of that same aesthetic. But she didn't buy, she may have done, but she was more focused on buying paintings by local artists. So instead of buying a print from a European artist, she went and bought a set from an artist, and we do have his name, someone called Latif, but it's quite rare to have an artist, and she bought a set of paintings. And these paintings are quite different from the picturesque aesthetic. They are generally seen, if you have a whole, these are details here, but if you see the Taj from up front, it's very symmetrical, none of the extraneous, details of the garden, etc. Much more connected, I guess you could say, to a Mughal aesthetic of very, acute detail of all the elements of the Pietra Dura, for example, and also details, as you can see here. Oh, that's what was supposed to be on the screen as I said that. So that's what I mean by, do you see the difference between the Daniels, who is shown with the trees in front, and here it's, appreciating its symmetry. And then here's an image which shows you some of the detail. These were particularly popular as it was quite difficult to see the detail inside because it's quite dark. So having an artist rendition with all these incredible details inside were very valuable. So as well as the British artists and the so-called company artists that I've just described, there are also some Indian artists who trained in the European watercolour technique. So the most famous one is someone called Sita Ram, that some of you may have come across. And he accompanied Hastings around India and painted all sorts of different buildings around India. And this is an unknown artist. Murshidabad artist is as far as we can get, but also trained in the British watercolour technique, as you can see with the image on your right, on the left, sorry. And what you can see here in this image is, at first sight, it looks fairly accurate, but then you can see the two buildings on either side are being kind of turned outwards so that you can see more. So it's giving you this illusion that you're seeing more of the buildings. And the Daniels, going back to the Daniels, they often played around, let's say, with accuracy, exaggerating proportions of buildings, sometimes putting buildings that aren't side by side in a painting, and things like that. And then I just wanted to show you this, which is actually a postcard, which has a very similar viewpoint, but here you can only obviously see the building on the right because it's a photograph. But what's interesting about the early photographs is that they tend to also mimic this picturesque aesthetic. It's one of the things I'm arguing in the chapter. So photographs, artists continue to come, through the early first half of the 19th century, but they started to dwindle in the second half of the 19th century, largely because of photography arriving. So once you had photographs, you could get an image of the Taj, even in an even more affordable way. And the prime, I'll get you a photo. So this is a photograph by Samuel Bourne. He was one of a series of artists who turned up in Agra, not just Agra, but obviously that's the focus of this talk, but he went around India taking photographs and then selling prints. The first photographic record of the Taj was in the 1850s by someone called John Murray. Samuel Bourne came pretty soon after him and set up a studio with someone called Charles Shepherd. So, if you start researching 19th century photographs, you're going to come across Bourne and Shepherd. And then there was also Felice Beato and Sachet, among others. But as I say, a lot of these photographs adopt these similar viewpoints of trying to see the Taj obscured by the garden, etc. And it may be no coincidence that Bourne's photograph, this one, was around 1866, because this was a time when there was a Darbar held there in November. This was something Rana was very keen for me to talk about in the chapter. And this occurred in, I have not written the date. Oh, I just said 1866. So this was on the 15th of November of that year. 5 days before the Darbar, the Maharaja of Gwalior decided to hold a grand party on the Taj Mahal. And he invited all the elite of Indian and European society. And there's a quote, maybe I won't read out the whole thing because we'll be here all night, but one of the guests called Louis Rousselot described the garden appearing like a gigantic fairy scene. And he goes on and on about the trees covered in fruit and flowers, and then that suddenly at 10 o'clock, it was dark obviously, the whole Taj was lit up. And the effect, but he then goes on to describe, that was all well and good and rather lovely, but it then goes on to describe this slightly disturbing scene in my eyes of Europeans all sitting at tables drinking champagne while everyone else stood. And we've got a rare image, which is in a manuscript now in the British Library. It's in a history of Shah Jahan from 1815, and we can see here these Europeans kind of hanging out on the terrace and in not a very good way. And Fanny Parks, our heroine, she was appalled at the festive use of the Taj Mahal. She visited a few decades earlier, before this party I'm describing, and she describes disapproving of the military bands and dances taking place. And she says, can you imagine anything so detestable? European ladies and gentlemen have a band to play on the marble terrace. Anyway, she goes on about that and then carries on about how she finds it a deeply spiritual place and can't understand this partying going on in the Taj. So on we go with artists continue to come. Few examples here that you're going to find. I'm not sure exactly where they are on the walls, but the one on the lower right, I think, is down there somewhere. So by this point, Agra had moved to a more peripheral position politically, but as I just said, artists continued to arrive. Quite more famous ones were Edward Lear. You may have heard of Edward Lear. He did a long journey around India and spent some time in Agra. There was also an artist called Albert Goodwin, who did this rather ethereal drawing, kind of with white highlights on the top right. There were also this artist, Charles Bartlett, this print on the bottom right here. He travelled to India and Japan, and in fact became one of the most talented non-Japanese to work in this particular medium of woodblock prints. And you can see some other examples by Japanese artists further down there on the right. So the style of the paintings, the style of the prints is quite different. As you can see, these very sketchy paintings, very different to the Hodges and Daniels I showed you at the beginning. But still this kind of picturesque, romantic aesthetic persists. That's still what grabs the Europeans. They still want to see the Taj embedded in a landscape setting, seen perhaps at an angle. But this was about to change because, a little bit before these paintings, in fact, the garden, as I described at the beginning, was very overgrown until Lord Curzon arrives in Agra. I'm sure you've all heard of Lord Curzon. Not the most effective viceroy, it has to be said, but he was genuinely deeply fascinated by architecture and was actually quite obsessed with the Taj. He arrived first in 1885, immediately smitten. I won't describe his quote because I'm talking too much. But about a decade later, when he actually became viceroy and had more weight and power to be able to do something about it, he became fixated on restoring the Taj. And, he did do some good things, you could argue, in restoring a lot of the buildings, making sure the Pietrodura was in place. He was the one who put the white marble benches that everyone sits on to this day. Interested to know whether you like them or not. But the slightly questionable thing that he did was to make some drastic restoration changes in the garden. So this wild, overgrown garden that had all sorts of fruit trees and flowers. It would have smelt delicious as you walked around. He decided to cut that all down and have manicured lawns with cypress trees. And that is so the photograph on the left is a Samuel Bourne photograph. That's showing much earlier. You can see the overgrown garden here, looking rather lovely. And then, obviously, this is a pared down version. It's leaving out quite a lot, but you can see how the change in the garden here in these two images, early 20th century ivory image on the bottom right. So, although it probably did need some little bit of pruning, his changes were very dramatic, and he moved the garden far away from Shah Jahan's original plan for a Johar Bagh garden with all sorts of other plants and trees in it. So I'm drawing to a close. And just to say that, so I've talked about the very early paintings at the beginning of the 18th century, the arrival of photography, middle of the 19th century, and then the continuing arrival of artists, now more amateur artists towards the end of the 19th century. Sorry, get some minutes. Oh yeah, no, I'm going to just backtrack a bit. Most of the visitors that I'm talking about, and others besides, they all talk about the fact they just don't know how to describe it. it's impossible to describe. It's too beautiful to describe. And in a sense, that's why we've got all these images, because you need to see the Taj. It was impossible to describe its beauty. And I mean, I could go on and on with different quotes. There's a Swiss art historian who arrives and calls it the true spirit of India. There's a German philosopher that said it's perhaps the greatest artwork which the forming spirit of mankind has ever brought forth. Very kind of 19th century speak. And on it goes. But for the British, the classical symmetrical proportions of the tomb set in this originally overgrown wild garden was the ideal picturesque composition. And the love between Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal ensured the Taj was also a romantic icon and seen as this vision of eternal beauty. That's what they were trying to produce in these paintings. I'll end there.
Wonderful.